Yes, I have started the recording, and I think most of you have been in other classes, but just to remind you that by staying in the call and having your camera on, you are agreeing to be in the video of the class. So if you don't want to be taken by the video recording, you can just close your camera. Of course, if some of you are happy to be with the camera on, it's always nice to see some faces anyway. Yes, I was saying that the topic of today is descriptive sensory testing. The learning points will be, we will go first a bit into analytical methods in sensory science, a bit in general, and then we will go very much into detail on descriptive analysis, so how to run descriptive testing. And of course, we will refer to objectives and application. So for what we do sensory testing and the when and why. I will appreciate if everyone, well, I will mute you all now, but please remember to be muted so we don't have strange sounds in the call. Very good. So first, definition of sensory evaluation. I think this was touched by Riette also in a previous lecture. As a reminder, sensory evaluation or sensory analysis, it's a scientific method used to evoke, measure, analyze, and interpret those responses to products as perceived through the senses of sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing. So it's a scientific method, and as such, there is quite a lot of structure and planning around it. So some things you saw, for example, in the lecture with Ingun on design of experiment, you will see more, for example, on statistics related to sensory evaluation in the next classes. And as you already have seen, sensory evaluation is not just tasting and saying how much we like something, but there is a quite strong scientific methodology around it. We can divide the types of methods in sensory science in two big groups. One that is analytic sensory methods, that are those methods that we run with trained subjects, so with trained panels, where we use subjects to detect and to measure. So it's in a way using a group of subjects as an instrument, and as such, we will see that it's a calibrated instrument. So some of those methods could be discriminative methods, methods for quality control, or descriptive analysis. And then we have a also big group of methods that we call affective methods that are consumer based. So it's when we reach consumers to know things, for example, liking, preferences, or qualitative approaches, could be willingness to buy. So many things that we want to ask consumers of the products. So first of all, when we are going to run a test to know more about our samples, I think this schematic view of how to make the decision is quite nice, because first of all, we need to select what type of methods. Is it a consumer acceptability question, or is it a sensory analytical question? Then if it is a sensory analytical question, we will go to analytical testing, like, for example, discriminative testing or descriptive testing, as we are going to see. But in this type of test, we are not looking into acceptability, liking, or preference. When we work with analytical testing and trained panels or semi-trained panels, we are looking into analytical questions. So description of differences or description of products. So one thing that is important is when we work with trained panels, we don't ever ask them for their liking, because we are using people as a measurement instrument. So as I mentioned, other type of analytical tests, so we can understand the difference between the methods. Discrimination tests are tests that help us to decide if two samples are different from a sensory standpoint significantly. So, for example, triangle test is one of these tests, or duo, trio, or pair comparisons. There are many different methods that we are looking only into if samples are different or not. Then other analytical sensory methods used quite a lot in the industry are quality control tests. I'm referring to sensory quality control tests because there are many. One could look, for example, into bricks measurement, into texture measurement. There are many measurements one can take as quality control test of products, but there are also routine controls from a sensory point of view to ensure a stable sensory profile over time. This is also a type of analytical test. And the third type of analytical test where we will focus today is descriptive analysis. Descriptive analysis is used to establish a detailed specification of the sensory attributes of a product, and it can help us to compare several products. These products are described using relevant attributes by a sensory panel. This panel should be trained and calibrated for each of the attributes that are of interest. And usually we measure these attributes on scales that range from no intensity to high intensity for each of them. We can analyze the data statistically to find which attributes describe the differences among samples. We will go into detail in all these points. But what are the applications of descriptive analysis? It sounds quite complex. So there are many applications. As you will see, descriptive analysis, there are different methods that they were brought about to sensory science in the 50s, 60s of the last century, and they have been perfected and structured during these years. And if you look at the literature, for example, of the second half of the of last century and beginning of this one, there are many different applications of many products with descriptive analysis. So if you see, this will be, do you see my cursor? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, good, thank you. So if you see here, this it would represent a huge number of products and product categories that have been profiled from a sensory perspective. You can find it in the literature, also in the industry, for different objectives. For example, to see how a product changes before their best before date, for benchmarking to compare to the competitors, for draw conclusions into product formulation, etc., and also related to quality control. A very important application also of descriptive analysis is correlation to instrumental analysis. Of course, when we think about the industry, but also in research, it's very important to find the measurements that are easy or quick. And if these measurements, for example, texture measurements, color measurements, odor measurements, if those can reflect sensory perception, it's very interesting. But for that, I need to have the sensory measurement. Also, a big area of application is the use of preference mapping, where we combined this descriptive analysis of products with liking as gathered with consumers. Then through statistical analysis, I can draw or plot preference maps that will reveal what are the sensory attributes that are more liked by consumers. And as I said, during many years, there has been perfected and created principles of good practice in sensory analysis. And one of the things that has made it that descriptive analysis is one of the most used and more robust methods in sensory science is the, for example, the checking of panel performance and how we can analyze that. That is something you will see in the practical class with Matsalin and also with Ingun. So sensory descriptive analysis have different aspects. One aspect is qualitative, meaning what are the words, the terms, the attributes that define the sensory profile of a product. So that will be what words can I use to describe it. So for example, if you think which words would you utilize to describe a yogurt, so I'm sure some of you are thinking about sweetness, about creaminess, but when we subject a sample for its analysis to a trained descriptive panel, they will come up with many different attributes to describe a sample. For example, these are many attributes for a yogurt. Usually a panel will rate from 20 to 30 attributes for a product that will give a very detailed fingerprint of the sensory characteristics of the product. And already this, so far we are just coming up with words that describe a food product. This could be enough to characterize roughly some samples and compare them. So for example, you can use a word cloud, as you see there, to characterize a product. And if you compare two products that are different enough, these word clouds will be quite different. So this could help you to profile samples in an easy way with almost no training required, just coming up with the words that are more relevant for each of the products. But today we will focus mainly on quantitative aspects, and that means scaling of individual attributes. So for example, sweetness from low to high. And this type of data can be afterwards, for example, presented like a radar or spider web plot. You have there an example of futu from different yam varieties. Where you can see that some different samples, in this case 5 samples, were profiled with different attributes by a panel: lumpy, fibrous, springy, sticky, loose, etc. And here we can see the intensities of each of the attributes. And then we can really see the differences of the sensory profiles. We could also think about temporal aspects of the sensory description, because when we think about food, it's not only we can say, okay, this beverage is sweeter than this one, so that we will refer to intensity. But also in many products, in-mouth product changes as we are eating are very important. So it's also important to have a detailed information on the changes in flavor or texture over time. This could be especially relevant, for example, when we are using, if you imagine we are using high intensity sweeteners to lower the content of sugar. Sweetness level could be quite similar between sugar and an artificial or high intensity sweetener, but the sweetness profile is very different because how the sweetness comes up and disappears in the mouth is very different. Or here in the slide, you see different chocolate samples with different cocoa percentages. So you see a very mild 28% cocoa chocolate, where when you have it in mouth, then first you perceive sweetness, then milk flavor, then butter, then caramel, and also butter in the end. While for an 80% cocoa chocolate, mainly you feel very much very intense the cocoa flavor and the bitterness, and some of the other attributes are not relevant during the eating time. So this is how different attributes develop over time. So of course, when we taste samples, it's not only about the level of sweetness, but also about how it evolves or other attributes. And finally, in some food categories, the global aspect of the sensory description is very important. So it's kind of an integrated approach. So this is very typical of, for example, of the wine sensory evaluation, when words like complex, round, balanced, or the impact are assessed, or for example, the coffee or the tea industry. But these kind of descriptions are quite difficult to obtain and difficult also to train a panel. For example, how do you train the panel in complexity? How do you define complexity in a product? So if we think about different quantitative descriptive methods, this is kind of a historical overview, and we are not going to go through all of them, but the first one was the flavor profile method developed in the 1950s, and then there were many others coming up during the years. One of the most utilized is quantitative descriptive analysis, QDA, developed in the 1970s. But there are others very much used, like spectrum methods, etc. But nowadays, most labs use what we call a generic descriptive analysis. Then it's mainly based on QDA, but a bit mixed between QDA and spectrum. I put a reference there for you if you want to read a bit more about all these different methods. We will focus on generic descriptive analysis. We will sometimes call it quantitative descriptive analysis because generic descriptive analysis is based on it. So I was talking about trained panels. So we will refer today mostly about trained panels. And these trained panels for QDA or generic descriptive analysis are usually with 10 to 12 trained assessors. There is a panel leader who moderates the discussion, and it is not part of the testing. So of course, she or he may be very well, they should know very well the samples and have tasted them beforehand, but the testing itself is done by the trained assessors, and the panel leader could only moderate the discussion. Each attribute, each sensory attribute would be measured on a scale, usually unstructured line scales like the ones you have down here. So it's a line where we have two anchors that are usually a word, and the panelists will taste the sample and strike on the point to signal the intensity. So for example, sweetness from low to high intensity. And then we will get continuous data that could be analyzed by conventional statistics like ANOVA or multivariate analysis like principal components analysis. You will have a lot on this on the next lectures with Madsaling and Ingun. And in QDA, quantitative descriptive analysis, these scales are not absolute. So what is low sweetness for a product? Imagine if you are tasting a jam or if you are tasting a yogurt, then the low and the high sweetness will be completely different. So these extremes of the scales are very different, but also it can be different, used by different assessors, because different panelists or assessors have different sensitivities. So if you see the example down here, this is a panelist rating sample A and B, for example, in crispness. Crispness is rated in this scale from less to more. It could have been low to high. And panelist 1 has sample A here and sample B here, while panelist 2 has sample A here and sample B here. So these are the differences between the samples, and these are the difference within panelists, like the comparison of the difference between panelists. And in general, when we train the panel in QDA, in quantitative descriptive analysis, we mainly look at they have a similar ranking of the samples and they use similar parts of the scales, but we are not looking into that they all have exactly the same number on the scale. Other methods like spectrum work on absolute scales, but not QDA. So these are all the steps that we need to follow in a quantitative descriptive analysis. And we will use all these kind of yellow boxes throughout the presentation. So we can refer back to these steps. So first of all, we need to select and screen panelists. We need to train them, then to conduct a study and to analyze the data and report. Within the training of the panelists, we will need to have a vocabulary development, meaning the specific attributes that will be used for the descriptive analysis. We need to train them in recognize those attributes and use the scales to measure them. And we need to check the performance that the panel is working well to describe that. So how do we select and screen assessors or judges in a trained panel? Important criteria is that we look for people that they have a sensory acuity better than the average. So we look for people that have good sensory sensitivity, that they can recognize all the basic tastes, that they can rank samples with regard to different attributes. So this could be a screening test that we could use with them. For example, threshold, basic taste recognition, ranking. But apart from having a good sensory acuity, we also want them to have an analytical frame of mind. What does it mean? We could be very sensitive to certain tastes or flavors or odors, but if we don't know how to express that or to analyze that, then we are not very good as a panelist. Also that we are articulate and we can describe our perception. And very important that the panelists should have good communication skill and teamwork, because the panel should work together as a team. Once we have selected and screened our subjects, they will undergo an extensive training on attribute recognition, attribute scaling, use of references, description of certain products, and they will be subjected to a study of individual performance and panel performance. So of course, this is kind of the golden standard. And let's say, okay, I have a pool of people that I can make tests to. We start maybe with, I don't know, maybe 30 people. We screen them and we in the end keep these 12 people that we want to keep, or 10, and to form our panel. But of course, if we work for a small company where we don't have too many people available or resources, reality bites, and maybe we have a pool of people that we need to use. So it's also important to train them. It could be that they are not as sensitive as we would want, but we can subject them to a good training to be good members of a trained sensory panel. And also, of course, here we are talking about the best practice in QDA, but we need to adapt to the reality of our industry or research group. So, of course, we need to make the most of it, and this is what we are going to talk about today. Then we go to the vocabulary development, how to generate these descriptors or attributes. And then we can generate them, for example, from brainstorming. So we can have the panel, give them a number of products, and they can brainstorm and generate a list of attributes. They can be from a previous project. If we are working with products that we have worked with before, we can bring up the list of attributes and see which ones are relevant for the new project. Also, it could be that we have a sensory lexicon. So, for example, it could be an aroma wheel. It could be from literature. Or it could be that if we are working for a customer, that this could be specified descriptors by the customer. When I mean customer, it could be an internal customer of the industry, or could be a customer from the sensory team in the university. So we are working for another project, and maybe they have some particular interest on what to describe in the product. This is an example of the very well-known wine aroma wheel developed by the University of Davis. There are for many different types of wine, and they are also sensory wheels or aroma wheels for other products like spices, bread. For example, at Nofima, we developed one on marine oils. So you can find in the literature and online very many of these wheels where you have many attributes that are already listed and classified. So then for the vocabulary development, what we want to do is generate a list of attributes that are objective, that are consensus, consensus meaning that all the panelists agree on them, and the use. And then we need to choose the attributes that we will use in the project. What is relevant for the problem, what is relevant for the product, and what attributes are useful to find differences among samples. Because of course, attributes can be many, but then what is really interesting for the objective at hand. So an example could be, okay, we are rating different strawberry yogurts where it has been changed the thickener and the sweetener for making a low fat and low sugar yogurt. But for all the samples we have used the same type and amount of natural colorant, and all the samples for the project, they have the same pink or red color. Then even if red color it's a relevant attribute for that sample, this strawberry yogurt, it won't be a relevant attribute for the project or the objective that is comparing these two samples. So as the panel, at the end of the day, they will need to rate a big number or a big amount of attributes. We need to reduce those to the ones that are really relevant for the product, the problem, and highlighting differences among samples. So I have mentioned the word attribute and sensory attribute many times already in these 28 minutes. So what are the attributes? So the attributes should describe different aspects of the product. So the appearance, for example, color, surface, visual texture, the odor, manual texture, so how it looks like. It could be rough in the surface. It could be a smoothie or a drink that when we tilt the glass, we see how it flows. So then we have an idea of the manual texture, or could be a dairy product that we can spoon. So this is a manual texture, or how we press a bread or a fruit. Also, they will describe the taste. So that means the basic tastes, like sweetness, bitterness, saltiness, umami, and sourness, but also the flavor, that is this mix between taste and aroma. Trigeminal sensations like burning or hot or coolness. And also after swallowing, we have the aftertaste and afterfeel. So you see that there are many different groups of attributes and different modalities. When we say modalities, we refer to, are we evaluating with the hand, with the touch, with our eyes, so the sight, smell, or the taste. So we use all our senses in the evaluation. When we think about texture, there are many textures where sound is also relevant. For example, if we think about crispy food. So there are many aspects of the product that one can rate. So we need a very precise language, because we said we will use people as an instrument that should be calibrated. So the panel creates their own scientific language for the product category. And it should be consensus in the sense that there's the same understanding of the descriptors among the assessors. It will be good also to get a reference for each description. So I said, okay, what is sweetness from low to high? What is low in this product, or what is high? This reference could be verbal, or also could be a physical reference. So in the example you have there, like the firmness assessment, that it will be the resistance of deformation with the molars. From low to high, you can give an example of, okay, low will be like butter, and high will be a raw carrot. So this could be a verbal description, but it could also be a physical reference of similar products or other products. But important characteristics of the descriptors or the attributes is that they should discriminate among the samples, as the example I just gave of the red yogurt. They should be non-redundant, so we shouldn't assess many attributes that mean the same for the sample, because also that could be tiring for the panelists. Ideally, they should be actionable, meaning if we are measuring with some objective. So if we are measuring different attributes on this yogurt that we have modified for lowering the sugar and the fat, then the things we are measuring in the modified yogurt should help us to reformulate the product. And also ideally should relate to consumer acceptance and rejection. So I said that it would be ideal that the attributes are not correlated or are not measuring the same, but it's also important to think, because sometimes the panelists may have preconceived ideas about which attributes are correlated or not, and it's important to decorrelate them. So for example, hard and dense are many times correlated, so products that are denser can be harder many times. However, it could be some products where these two attributes are not correlated at all. So think about a cream cheese is very dense and not hard, while an aerated chocolate could be very hard but not dense at all. So these are the things that you should discuss with your panelists when they are developing the list of attributes. So this list, we don't want to repeat attributes. We said if things that are not relevant, don't include it in the list. However, we need to include all relevant attributes to avoid dumping. What does it mean? That if the panelists need an attribute to describe some sensory characteristic of the product and they don't find that attribute, they maybe add this perception to another attribute, which could make your data less robust. Also, one need to think that some attributes are very simple or easy to measure because are singular, simple attributes like sweetness. We all understand what sweetness is. It's related to a basic taste and generally very easy to agree on and describe. However, there are other sensory attributes that are complex. If you think about creaminess, it's a combination of smoothness, viscosity, fatty or cream flavor. So it could be different aspects of it, like different texture and flavor related attributes. So we may like to creaminess have different aspects of it related into the sensory ballot. Also, I mentioned before these attributes that are too complex, more holistic, like complexity or impact. It could be that for your product category, let's say wine, they are important, but we need to be able to define them and scale them with the panel. So this is an example of creaminess, that it's a very complex sensory attribute from a paper we published some years ago. And you can find very different definitions, of course, in the dictionary, but on different papers. So you need to see what are the definitions that could be applicable to your products to discuss with your panel. So one of the stages of the training would be recognition and scaling of the attributes. So the panelists would need to single out, so to recognize the flavor or the texture characteristic we are discussing, and we need references. I refer to this wine aroma wheel that is well known, and the wine industry, of course, it's an industry that has a lot of money behind, so there are many commercial standard references that one could use for panel training. But of course, that's not really the case for other product categories. So in this case, we need to find out references. But also for wine, here I have an example from a paper on red wine characterization, where we came up with a list of different references. Some of them were standard references, for example, from these sets, but other ones were lab-made. For example, aroma reference standard for red wine could be Queen's, 1 centimeter piece of Queen's jam soaked for 3 hours and removed. And so you have many examples here. And of course, when you arrive to this list of reference standards, it has a lot of work behind, and it should be relevant for your product category. So once the panel is trained in recognition of the attributes, they need to be trained on the scaling of those attributes. So they need to understand the scale and the anchors, and we should work towards some type of precision where they have same use of scale or same ranking. As I was saying in the beginning, a QDA, quantitative descriptive analysis, is not an absolute technique. So we will be looking that they use the same part of the scale. Also, we would like them to be reliable, so able to repeat their assessment, and that can replicate, for example, by assessing the same sample 2 or 3 times. But you will speak about this, so how to assess panel performance. You will speak a lot about this in the next lectures. And then when we have trained the panel in use of scale and scaling of attributes, you will need a training for a specific project or a specific product category. If we come back to the example of the yogurt, where we wanted to have low fat and low sugar, if we are going to describe yogurt for that project, it won't be the same as if we are changing, for example, the colorant and the fruit concentration. So the training should be also project specific. So then you will have a brainstorming with the panelists where they are exposed to a range of products relevant to the project, and they will be able to write down the descriptors and they will discuss them. So this discussion for a specific product or project category should be led by the panel leader. As you see in the picture there, here is the round room where NOFIMA's trained panel have open discussion. This is one of the panel leaders, and they are looking at their own data on the screen. So they have assessed some samples and they are discussing. And typically they will, it should be an open process with no criticism. So it's not that you are going to pick out there and then some assessors that have, for example, not understood an attribute, but it has to be a very constructive discussion. So the discussion should be about levels, about the significance of the attributes, about the definition on how to describe the attributes and so on, how to group the samples. For example, if panelists have come up with citrus, spices, and lemony, maybe they want to put them in a group in the ballot. And the objective is to end up with a consensus list with clear written definitions. So in the first stages of the training, once you have this list of attributes, you would like to see if panelists are able to discriminate among samples and to rate them. So then, for example, you can start with an easier scale where it's a point scale instead of a line scale, and then go to a line scale. Also, you can start, for example, with ranking test and then go to rating scales. And you can combine individual work of the panelists when they are tasting and rating with open sessions with discussion to discuss the different samples. And of course, it could be that you need further sessions. So maybe you planned your training, but you see that some panelists are still not in line with the rest, or some attributes are not well defined. So this is really an iterative project where you need to revise and see if everyone are in agreement, if the reference starters are okay, if the list of descriptors is okay, if they have a consensus in the definition, and if the panel is reproducible. And if not, you should repeat and list until you have a consensus list with clear written definitions, and subject the panel to panel performance check. You will speak about this in the next classes, so I won't go into detail on the panel performance. So this is an example of the description of the attributes. I said you need to define the attributes and describe them. So if you see, this is a ballot for description of bread texture, where you have different textural attributes. It's just a part of a ballot. So you have visual texture, manual, and oral. So you have, for example, manual texture, and the panel would measure elasticity And this is described as evaluation of the speed of spring back after pressing down on the breadcrumb in the center of the slice with the middle finger. For example, if you are measuring, in this case, was maybe related to shelf life. So then the bread starts being dry and it gets harder closer to the crust. So then you really need to define where they will measure. So that is in the middle, in the center of the slice, for example. So the panelists are not measuring on different parts of the bread sample. Other definition could be oral texture, stickiness, force necessary to remove the material from the teeth with the tongue, or hardness, force necessary to bite through a piece of the center of the slice with your front teeth. So of course, as you see, this is very thorough. And at the beginning, the panelists will need to check. So they need to have a sheet with these definitions at hand, and they will check. But of course, after they are well trained, they remember and they do quite automatically all the evaluation. This is another example of yogurt description. So again, textural attributes that, for example, are visual, manual, or oral, and their description. So this is an example for ketchup made with different thickeners. And you have, for example, visual bubbles, amount of bubbles evaluated visually on the surface of the sample, or manual viscosity, evaluation of the resistance of the sample to be stirred clockwise 3 times with a spoon. So all this work has to be done with the panel, so they come up with a consensus definition of the different attributes. And after hard work and when you arrive to the evaluating ballot, you need to calibrate to conduct the study, and you start by calibrating for the specific sample set. So usually you use 2 extreme samples that spread the sensory range or variation, and you will take a look at the difference between sample, check the use of the descriptors that are their consensus, they are individual, and then you will double check that everything is okay. If you need more references or training, if you need to remove or add attributes, and if you need to repeat the calibration, but hopefully not at this stage. And then you conduct a study where you evaluate the samples that were objective of your study according to principles of good practice that you already discussed in another class. And the assessment is usually according to sensory modalities and in order of perception. So normally starting with appearance of the sample, then odor, taste and flavor, texture, and aftertaste. And as I said, usually it's 10 centimeter lines that are used, anchored, the scales anchored in the extremes. And these anchors can be different depending on the attributes. They could be low to high, as we said in sweetness example, but if it's roasted, color could be from light to dark, or if it's number of particles, from none to many. So it needs to be relevant for the specific attributes. And the number of attributes, how many attributes to use, of course, this is product dependent, because if the sample, if we are assessing a juice that is liquid and won't have many textural aspects, for example, probably either we can expand more on the flavor part and go more into detail, or we will need less attributes. But if we are assessing a multi-layered product, let's think about a pizza, or think about a fish nugget, or something that has different layers and different textures, different flavors associated to the layers, then probably we need a good number of attributes. So then we need to decide what are the ones relevant for the project. So this is an example from Riet's group on evaluation on functional quality of CoP45 sorghum foods. And you see here the list of attributes, the definition of each of the attributes, the reference used, and the scaling. So when you have analyzed your samples in duplicate, then you could analyze and report the results. Usually you will use ANOVA, that could be a 3-way analysis of variance, or or other. You will go through this with Ingun. We use product, panelist, and replication as factors for the analysis. And also you can use multivariate analysis for plotting the results, for example, using principal component analysis. So this is a typical data presentation, a table where you present the means of each of the attributes and the significant difference. So these are different samples of apples that were stored from 0 to 61 days, and the different attributes for describing the storage, the sensory aspects of the samples during storage. So some of them are typical attributes like fresh taste or acidity, hardness, crunchiness, while other could be more typical of the long storage, like alcoholic odor, age odor, or mealiness. We can see how the more typical fresh attributes go down in intensity with the storage, like crunchiness from 6 to 4, while alcoholic odor went to 1 to almost 5 in the scale. And we use Taki test, for example, to look into the significant differences. Again, you will see more about the data analysis in the next lectures. This other data presentation I already mentioned, a radar plot or a spider web plot or spider plot, where you have all the attributes and the profiles that are really nice to really see what are the attributes that differentiate the profile. This was, for example, these pounded yams. And we see that, for example, in lumpiness, they are very different, or in springiness, they are very different. But if we are comparing too many samples, then these radar plots or spider plot could be quite complex to see. So then is when we use multivariate dimensionality reduction techniques or multivariate analysis, like principal component analysis. Don't worry, because this could be quite complex and you will look at it much more with Ingun in the next lectures. But just to see, because you will see a lot of PCAs in sensory data, and what we do is summarize all the attributes in a new plot where we can have the samples in a plot and the attributes correlated in another plot. So this is an example of milk-based desserts. We have a number of attributes and 8 different samples. When you see the spider plot, it's very complex to see something. So then you can reduce the number of variables using principal component analysis, and you obtain these nice b-dimensional displays where you can compare samples and attributes at the same time. And very important, I didn't put it in the first structure because it's not really part of conducting one study or training the panel, but it's very important to monitor and maintain your panel. If you have a fixed, stable panel in your company, that could be, or in your research team, could be people that you have hired just for that, or could be members of the team, but it's very important to keep them with good performance through retraining, but also enhancing motivation, so they would be happy to participate. Because even if they are doing a job that they could be paid for, that they are at the end of the day human beings, and they are acting as panelists, but they are people. So of course your panel would be as good as you train it, but as good as happy is, in a way. So you need to enhance and maintain the motivation. So in conclusion, descriptive analysis is an indispensable tool bridging product development and consumer appreciation, because you really can dissect the sensory aspects of the sample, so you really understand your sensory profile and being able to relate that to your product modification or the consumer liking, etc. It's it sets the basis for fundamental research into sensory analysis, because also help us to understand human senses and to understand how we perceive. It's very validated. You see, from the 50s, it started to grow, and there is a lot of publications on sensory analysis via descriptive analysis. It's very robust and precise. Results are coherent and stable in time, and the panel should be selected, trained, maintained, and calibrated. And to finish, right on time, because we still have almost 10 minutes, and I want you to watch this video. This video, we made it at NOFIMA. In fact, it was Matt Salin that will be teaching the next classes that made this video, with good practices of quantitative descriptive analysis in QDA. So let's see if I can. Are you seeing it? Can you hear it? You hear the music now?
No.
No. So wait a bit, because I need to change this in the settings. I will stop recording here because I need to change the settings.